Star Wars has a long history of almost released video games. A few examples are Star Wars Battlefront 3, the original, Star Wars 1313, which was the Boba Fett Coruscant game, or even Star Wars First Assault, the first-person shooter. But this video is going to cover Star Wars Project Ragtag, the third-person action-adventure game developed by Visceral Games. As always, all the links to the sources will be posted down in the description below, so make sure to check those out and support. And with that out of the way, let's get into what happened to Star Wars Project Ragtag. So Project Ragtag started development indirectly back in 2013 and was developed by Visceral Games, who was known before this for the development of the Dead Space franchise, Dante's Inferno, and many other titles. But after the release of Dead Space 3 in 2013 and EA labeling the latest entry as a failure, EA started to put more pressure on Visceral to create games that were not only single-player experiences. So instead of working on Dead Space 4, a large portion of the team started development on Battlefield Hardline, and a smaller team started development on an open-world pirate game with the codename Jamaica. Now in that same year, 2013, Disney shut down LucasArts Game Studio, which was currently working on Star Wars 1313, and the LucasArts studio was very close in proximity to Visceral Games. So important members of the LucasArts team went to Visceral to pitch them the current 1313 design and basically asked Visceral to hire essential members of the LucasArts team for their own. Instead, Visceral did offer to hire ex-LucasArts team members, but they wanted them to work on Visceral's current projects and they weren't going to pick up development of Star Wars 1313. 1 month after that, EA did actually work out a deal with Disney, and they claimed exclusive rights to the Star Wars games that did not include the casual games like Star Wars Lego. And EA announced that Visceral would be one of the studios who would begin to work on a Star Wars title. Visceral then had to cancel Project Jamaica in favor of a Star Wars title and pivot those resources to this new game. And the first codename, an iteration of their Star Wars titled Yuma, after the Arizona desert where the scenes in Return of the Jedi were filmed at Jabba's palace. And Visceral kept the pirate theme from Jamaica, but instead shifted the game from sea pirates to space pirates, and tried to move over as many of the assets and ideas as they could. A member of Visceral described the game as, quote, some hybrid between a linear action shooter where if you're on the ground it's Tomb Raider-like, but then in space it's going to be Black Flag. Another member of the team said, quote, you flew your Millennium Falcon-esque ship around, boarded other ships, raided pirates, got booty, and that kind of thing. But unfortunately, they did face a lot of hardships in development along the way, starting with Battlefield Hardline's development, which was having issues during 2014, so many members of the Star Wars team were diverted to the Battlefield team to help out with additional support. And it did hurt morale at the company, according to Jason Schreier, constantly switching between games, and because the games were so drastically different in terms of motive and end results, it really made it hard for the team to connect on how to move forward on either game. Things seemed to get better for a while at the company when Amy Hennig was hired. She was most known for working on Naughty Dog and being a big driving force behind the Uncharted franchise. And the hope was that she could be the force to take Project Yuma to completion and oversee development. Now, Yuma changed almost immediately as soon as she took the job. She didn't like the original pitch for Star Wars Yuma as an open-world space game, and instead wanted to make a single-player linear experience more like Uncharted, but set in the Star Wars universe with scoundrels in space. And she also wanted it to be a heist story, so Yuma was modified into Project Ragtag. A direct quote from Jason Schreier at Kotaku said, quote, the lead protagonist was Dodger, described as a cracked mirror version of Han Solo, and over the course of the game, he'd battle alongside a band of fellow misfits like Robbie, a gunslinger, and Dodger's partner in crime, Ona, the daughter of a mob boss, and Buck, the veteran leader and mentor of the crew. Set between the original Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back, Ragtag would focus on the impact of Alderaan's destruction and tell a story about criminal families, scoundrels, and action-packed heists. But in order to show that the game was different and better than Uncharted, gameplay promises were made to EA about the mechanics in-game. Visceral pitched the idea that the player would be able to play as multiple different members of this team, and they would each have their own abilities. They would also be AI controlled if you weren't playing as them as well, and they pitched this big idea of sabotage. Schreier's description for this in games as, quote, "These ideas were incredibly ambitious. Picture the Death Star and they all have jobs. One stormtrooper was on a command unit moving boxes around, some guy would be droids. It was supposed to be set up so it was all real and it felt like they had jobs to do. We wanted to tap into emotions so you could mess with the stormtrooper's emotions, go into a room, turn the lights off, he goes back in and turns them on, then you turn them off again. At a certain point, he starts getting spooked, acting irrationally, and bringing friends in." And in early 2015, everything seemed to be improving for the studio. The management style had changed drastically, and the team was given more control over their project, and management was reduced overall. Battlefield Hardline was finally shipped, but the bliss didn't last long as the team was split again. This time, half the team worked on Hardline DLC, and the other half was still working on Ragtag. And many members reported to Jason Schreier that the Star Wars team members were seen as the dream team and the favorite employees, while the less favorite and just more grunt work was done on the Battlefield Hardline DLC. And the Visceral team with the split still wasn't enough to truly start development on the game, so EA built a studio in Montreal to help with development, and this new studio was called EA Motive, which would provide an additional 70 developers to support Visceral. Even this additional workforce wasn't enough because now EA, on top of the single player mode, they also mandated that this game should include a multiplayer mode as well, which Schreier described as a space combat game and was like a scaled down version of Yuma, so the original pitch. So even with these 70 additional developers, they still weren't sure if they would be able to create a true single player experience and a multiplayer experience in the time frame they were given. But they weren't given too much of a choice, and Ragtag officially started development with 160 developers, and they were given a release date of May 2018. And even right at the start, there were still a few more problems. The first being that EA required Visceral to use the Frostbite engine to create Ragtag, and it wasn't just EA to Visceral, it's EA to all their studios. All their games must be developed in the Frostbite engine, which was a problem because the engine up to this point had only been used for first-person games. So all the features in-game would have to be built from the ground up from scratch by Visceral, which takes a lot of time, money, and resources. Another issue that concerned the developers was the issue of making a game for such a big property like Star Wars, which saw a lot of oversight on Disney's end, and every creative decision had to be approved by Disney down to the clothing of the main characters, which would take additional time, and it was in the back of many developers' minds while working if they were going to put in a lot of work on a character or a world or a design, and then it just could get shot down by Disney and all that work would be for nothing. And the last issue that they were concerned about at the start of development was the scope of the game. Visceral wasn't sure if they had the time or budget to create the game they promised. Some developers felt they couldn't even create one full companion in-game to be playable, and creating 5 or 6 was completely out of the question. And Visceral was still working out how they were going to add a big feature in-game to differentiate the gameplay from Uncharted. They weren't sure what that looked like, or what even they should start to look for to create some new features. And immediately the problem started. Schreier reported that Hennig was spread too thin on the project. She oversaw every aspect of the game's development, and because of that, development was slower than expected, and a lot of members of Visceral felt she was micromanaging and didn't appreciate the way that she was trying to get this game shipped. And everything changed again for the game. No official response was given by EA, but the studio EA Motive was no longer going to help Visceral with Ragtag, and Visceral was no longer given a budget for additional hires. So Visceral immediately cut the multiplayer mode in their scope of development and continued on with the development with the primary focus on a single player experience. The struggles for Visceral continued throughout 2016. EA started to lay off dozens of employees from May to December of 2016. And Schreier had also mentioned, on top of the layoffs, there were also many developers who left the studio and cited creative differences with Hennig on Ragtag because they had their own ideas and felt like they weren't being heard. So throughout 2016, the team never truly filled out, and many fundamental positions like art director remained completely unfilled, and they weren't given the budget to make these hires, so the game development had to continue with the small team they had. But behind the scenes, the game was still being built and milestones were being hit. According to Schreier, quote, they built a traversal system for Dodger and his partners, and at least graphically their work was looking great. And at E3 2016, we got our first look at the world they were creating, and the gameplay showed the main character Dodger exiting a cantina on Tatooine, but even the demo was not as it seemed and was shrouded in controversy later on. Schreier said, quote, you might not have even noticed the way Dodger touched that door, but for Visceral, that simple animation was months in the making. They spent hours and hours of development time just working on the way in which Dodger would touch the door. This was a frustrating experience for some members of the team who felt like they didn't have enough core features in place to be spending so much time on a demo. The demo may have looked good, but people who worked on it said you couldn't play very much. Dodger couldn't even shoot his gun, and we're all fine-tuning where his hand placement needed to be. We don't have a single environment for Dodger to exist in. How do you build a system if you don't know what your average area is gonna be? And through 2016 and up to 2017, the outlook of the game was looking worse and worse. Visceral was still not able to hire additional staff and get support for development, and more of the members of their studio were leaving due to creative differences and losing faith in the project. Entire teams at Visceral were lost, and the remaining members that were still there had lost a lot of faith unless major changes happened at the studio. But starting in 2017, EA added EA Vancouver to help Visceral with Ragtag, and had delayed the project from May to December of 2018, which at this point would give them all of 2017 and effectively all of 2018 to finish the project. The developers at Visceral quickly realized EA Vancouver would actually be taking over the project, and this led to issues between the two developers over the future of the game and what game they were really making. But the two studios were able to work together and put a demo together to show EA executives and to show the true potential of the game. The demo showed an AT-ST chase, the Tatooine shootout, and a descent into Jabba's palace, and while this sounded amazing, the actual details of the game were still debated among both studios. Visceral continued working on the game up until the middle of October, until EA announced they would be closing Visceral Games. Many of the former employees of Visceral looked for jobs within EA and at other studios, and EA Vancouver started development on their own Star Wars game. More information has come out since then. Kevin Kiner, the composer of Star Wars The Clone Wars and Rebels, was actually hired as the composer of Ragtag, and after the fact, his quote on the project said, quote, they spent a tremendous amount of money on that. I got to work with Amy Hennig, who did Uncharted. I was really honored she hired me. We went to Nashville and recorded with a great orchestra there. About an hour's worth of music, then they shut the game down, not because of the music. Kiner also said the music will not come out in any other form or in Star Wars properties, so it is unfortunate because he thinks it's some of his best work. Amy Hennig did an interview with USG and reflected on the project. She said, quote, I mean, all I can say is the project was going along fine, and in terms of my experience from Naughty Dog, that's what people don't realize about game development. It always looks like chaos until it doesn't. It never looks like it's going to come together, and then it does. And so part of what's challenging about making games, especially in a sort of larger organization, is how much of it is an act of faith, and that kind of just letting go and not worrying about the risk doesn't work on a spreadsheet, right? She continues on saying, quote, I wish people could have seen more of it because it was a lot further along than people ever got a glimpse of, and it was good, you know. but just didn't make any sense in EA's business plan. Ultimately, things changed over the course of the time I was there, so what can you do? And she closes out by saying, just like it was disappointing that Ragtag got cancelled, so who knows, maybe those ideas will get resurrected. This is not like this stuff getting erased, all of the work's there. I would love to see what they were making, just as I'd love to see people see what we were making. Now, in terms of her comment about it was a lot further along than what people had seen, Schreier did report that it did reach a bunch of gate and was up to a gate 3.5 in EA's development process. The game was playable, there were areas, but a lot of the problems developers had at their current state was the game was too similar to Uncharted and never really saw the unique feature that would bring people in. Hennig mentioning that she could see the game being remade continued on, and maybe we could see EA revisit these ideas in the future. Hennig actually reacted to Jedi The Fallen Order for Eurogamer, and she said, quote, "I don't know why the change of heart happened, because that was very clearly not an acceptable plan when we were working on Ragtag," in reference to making a single player experience like Fallen Order. But things change. The decision to cancel Ragtag was made in summer 2017. We found out in October 2017, so that's almost 2 years ago, and a lot has changed in that time. And there's been a pretty public and vocal backlash against the idea gamers don't want single-player finite games without all these extra modes. Of course they do, of course we do, so maybe this is just a demonstration of a change of strategy for EA. Now to close out this, as of now, EA has no plans to continue on with Ragtag and the leftover resources, but that doesn't mean it won't ever happen. For the most part, that's everything we know about Star Wars Ragtag and what happened to the series and why it was cancelled. It started out as a game too ambitious for its own good. It was also created at the wrong time for EA and single-player experiences. I don't think it helped the timing at which Visceral Games took on the project. It seemed every year they'd faced development problems, and then just when the game started to find its footing, Visceral Games was closed. So it was a combination of how expensive this game was to produce for EA, Visceral's past track record and history of single-player experiences. Another side story that didn't fit in here was Visceral's actually a West Coast game developer, so it's very expensive for EA to pay for housing and all these different opportunities for them with no tax benefits, when compared to studios in Canada and different areas of the United States, which is why Vancouver and Montreal were built from the ground up to support because it was so much cheaper. And that's what happened to Star Wars Ragtag and why it was cancelled. Make sure to like and share this video, subscribe for weekly gaming news, and I will see you guys in the next one.